going to give a talk that I was actually asked to give by my friend Jason Burton, who's from Western Australia, from their Alzheimer's Society, and it generated a lot of discussion, and I've been getting a lot of requests, and it turns out I'm probably going to be giving some version of this talk at least 10 times in the next several months. And it's one of these things as we leap forward in culture change that always holds us back, and that idea of risk, choice versus risk. So I'm hoping to give you some perspectives on that today. And I'm going to start with a couple of remarkable quotes, as I have some remarkable quotes sprinkled throughout the talk. The first one is from Ruth, Bartlett, and Deborah OConnor, who wrote this really wonderful book. If you want to take your dementia journey one step further, this is one I recommend. And they said oppressive and discriminatory practices often have their foothold in the well-meaning, well-intentioned ideas of those least intending to do harm. I think Daniela spoke to that this morning about how we do this out of kindness, but it's a sort of a paternalistic kindness that maybe is affected by our view of aging and our view of what our role is as a care partner. I'm excited that I'm going to get to have lunch with Deborah OConnor actually in BC in about a month, and so I finally get to meet her. Second one has already been said today, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. But Daniela's comment that much of what we call person-centered care is simply bossing people around in a very individualized way. And once again, I think that is the case, and I can't make a better case than Danny did about how to really cone down on this and say, you know, who is making this decision? And we might think it's for the person's best interest, but who's the one we're listening to? Is it us? Is it a family member? Who is it? You may be coming here excited about this talk, expecting lots of answers. I should probably add another quote, which I didn't put up here. One of my favorite quotes by Gertrude Stein, which is, "There is no answer, there never was an answer, there never will be an answer, that's the answer." So I'm not here to give you a cookie cutter but I'm going to give you some values and some ideas, and I'm hoping it will help you with some of your situations. And it really is, as the title says, relational. It all comes about in those relationships. That's why you can't use any kind of a program to tell you about this. Now, for those of you who don't know me, haven't heard me speak before, what I thought I'd do is just give a little what I call L101 here, because this is sort of how I've evolved my approach to dementia, and this is not what the talk is about, but I think it helps to have a little foundation of where I'm coming from, particularly with the MD after my name. It's a little different than what, I think I might have a little feedback here. It's a little different than what you might hear from other physicians. So really, my approach has developed an approach that rests on three basic pillars. The first one was to redefine dementia, redefine my view of dementia as not just neurobiology or a brain disease, but really looking at it as shifting experience. How is the person's experience and perception of the world around her changing over time? And first of all, this puts us in the person's shoes. It forces us to understand the person's perspective, which many other models don't. But the other thing that's kind of cool about this that I've discovered is that it really helps create a much more simplified pathway for people. As I've said recently, I think the two most complex things in the universe are the human brain and human relationships. And when you live with dementia, both of those become even more complex. And so when we're trying to figure out how to support people living with dementia, we don't need to add another layer of complexity to that. And there's a lot of education available out there. I've been through it, you've been through it, and most of the education focuses on telling you all the different kinds of dementia, what's going on in the brain, all the different stages of dementia, and does that make your job any easier to focus on those things? I was just online, somebody on Facebook linked me to some advocacy site, I don't even know who it was, but now they're talking about Alzheimer's dementia. What is Alzheimer's dementia? Well, Alzheimer's disease is when you have the process, but only when you have a certain cognitive level. Now you're labeled Alzheimer's dementia. I'm thinking, why? Why are we doing this? You know, so to me, what I want to do is something that, because I know what it's like to do this work. You know, I worked full-time in care homes for 2.5 decades with the people who are doing the hands-on work. And I know that when you are working with somebody, if they are distressed, if you have to know what their brain pathology is, what stage they are, in order to respond to them, you're never going to get your job done. We shouldn't make it rocket science. It's about relationships. It's about knowing the person. So I don't, you know, if Carrie is having an issue, I don't have to worry about what's going on in her brain or what her stage is. It's who is Carrie, what is she living with, what are her strengths, what are her challenges, what's her experience of the world, how do I help her? And I know that certain types of brain pathology may have certain characteristic patterns, but what that does is it puts people in pigeonholes and stereotypes them. And I don't want to know that. I want to know what this person in front of me needs. And I don't want to put those rules about people, those stereotypes. It would be just as crazy as to say, okay, people of a certain ethnicity or religion are going to behave a certain way, and this is the way you talk to them. I mean, that sounds offensive, doesn't it? Is it any different to say, this is what you do with a Lewy body patient? Is it really that different? So this is nice because it frees us from all that technical know-how that I certainly can't remember, and I don't expect anyone else to remember. And I've shifted to a more appreciative focus, which is instead of just trying to mitigate distress or decline, let's use well-being as a primary outcome. 7 billion different definitions of well-being, but I'll work with one today. And we'll get back to that. And the third part, ta-da, this is the culture change exchange, okay? You can have a really beautiful view of what the person's experiencing. You can have a meaningful relationship with them. You can have well-being as your primary outcome. But if your systems do not support you acting the way you do, if you don't have the permission, if you don't have the flexibility, then you can't do your job and you can't help that person the way you need to. And this really is a three-legged stool. You cannot do any two of these without the third and really reach that degree of success. So I'm talking about autonomy, and I based my my well-being model on a white paper from 12 years ago. And this is the way they defined autonomy. These are some of the words they use. I'm going to take it a little deeper today than just these things, but we kind of know what choice is, I think. We don't need to spend a lot of time with this. What I did, this was a model of 7 domains of well-being: identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy. And I rearranged them from the way they were originally published. And what I liked about them is that unlike some other measures, these are not related to what you're able to do. So for instance, Kitwood says, ability to initiate social contact is an indicator of well-being. Well, does that mean a person that can't initiate social contact can't have a sense of well-being? So I wanted to get beyond what you can do. These truly, to me, are universal across ages, ethnicities, abilities, health, or illness. And the nice thing is that that's a charge for all of us. If we can't cure dementia, we can still improve a sense of well-being in these different areas. So I made this kind of hierarchy, not to suggest that some domains are more important than others, but if you want to help restore a sense of well-being to people who have lost it, either through their illness and or through the care system, then I think there's a logical sequence. And I think that you can't bring well-being very easily to strangers. And so identity and connectedness form the base of my pyramid. And above that, when you have trust, familiarity, etc., security and autonomy come in, and we'll spend a lot of time on that today. Now Maslow, put safety at the bottom, but he was talking about food and shelter. But security here is more than physical safety. It's emotional, psychological security. It's trust, familiarity, respect, dignity, privacy, balance. All those things are part of security. And it works its way up. But if you look at the way I've positioned these, you'll see that autonomy has lots of touch points here. It's sitting on identity and connectedness, it's side by side with security, and it's also touching meaning and growth above it. And so I wanted to talk about those touch points. Oh, quick thing, because Cammie, thanks for the wonderful presentation, both of you. It was just great. You mentioned, first of all, I love that you did sorry about that. You talked about the Eden plagues of loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. And I discovered something when I rearranged these in the pyramid, that you can break those plagues into subatomic particles. If you don't have identity or connectedness, you have loneliness. If you don't have security and autonomy, you have helplessness. If you don't have meaning, growth, and joy, you have boredom. So this is another way to find the antidotes to those plagues, is to enhance these domains of well-being. So I thought that was kind of a nice correlation. It was unintentional when this was designed, but it just came out that way. So if we look at those touch points, we have identity bumping up against these different domains in my diagram. So I want to break these down into 3 sections and talk about how each of these can be a challenge to a person's ability to choose and to have some control over their lives. And I'm going to spend most of the time on that second one, but a little bit on the first, and if we have some time, a little bit on the third as well. So you okay? It's been a long day. You hanging in there? Okay. Hold up number 1 if I'm too fast. Where'd Cammie's sides go? Okay, so how well-meaning people can erode autonomy related to identity and connectedness? Well, there are many things, and we've talked a lot about the stigmas of dementia. And those stigmas are an outgrowth of not only the way we're taught what dementia is, but they're also an outgrowth of ageism and ableism too, because many people living with dementia are both older and less able. So this really is a sub-component of the ageism that Dan was talking about. And Dan did say that we all have, a little bit of ageism inside us that we have to confront. And I would like to try to convince her that I don't have any, but she's now had the experience of watching me get behind the wheel of a car. So, and it's not really so much ageism as it is speedism, I guess. And I'm guilty of a terrible stereotype. I'm now stereotyping certain makes and models of cars as cars I don't want to drive behind. And I won't say what they are because you might drive them. But and they're only stereotypes, But we all have to fight this. And what happens with ageism when you're taught the person's fading away or stigma, that the person's no longer there, that they're incapable, is that you have low expectations. And that creates the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expect less, you provide an environment where the person cannot flourish, and then you get the outcome you expected, and you say, see, I told you they couldn't do it. They had dementia. This happens in our education system. It happens with people of minority ethnicity or religions. It happens in all kinds of places and very much with dementia. Staging systems, assessments, categorizations, I spoke to that a little bit. They tend to look at what people can't do and not really who people are. And they're very discrete things, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But we ask, can you spell world backwards? Can you subtract 7 from 100 5 times? But we don't say, can you play the piano? Can you read a book to a child? People with very low cognitive scores can do these things, but we have no tools to measure those. Our communication and care practices can really squelch autonomy. I'll talk more about that as we get later on. Care systems and staffing patterns squelch autonomy. If you don't know the person, you're not going to enable choice. So if you're constantly rotating around, then that's another problem. BPSG, thank you, Dan, so much for that. I'm going to hit it a little bit more. I'm not sure if I can do it more beautifully than you did, the behavioral psychological symptoms of dementia. But I have a few more comments because it's in every talk, no matter what the subject is. I bring it around to this so I can harp on this a little bit. And even segregated living environments can squelch autonomy. And I'm just going to take a couple of these and very, very quickly go over some of them. Stephen Sabat, several years ago, wrote about things that society values. And these are some of the things he listed. Experiencing pride, maintaining dignity, concern for others, communication, maintaining self-esteem, spiritual awareness. Even though we often see them well-maintained in people with dementia, we see them in no assessments. We do not recognize them. So once again, this shows how a focus on discrete cognitive tasks or on deficits doesn't help us see the whole person or appreciate who the person is. And I think the talks this afternoon and this morning have really shown the gifts that are unleashed when you have people in the right environment where they truly can be empowered to be themselves. BPSD, here we go again. And I agree with Dan that the really problematic thing here is this idea that people's expressions are symptoms of dementia. And that's true. If you think it's a symptom of disease, you're going to use a pill. It actually, I think this was meant to help people with other interventions. But the truth is it's created a slippery slope to drug use. I think that the biggest barrier to reducing antipsychotics has been the BPSD framework that we are all taught to use, because it teaches us and people are doing it because their brain's diseased. It ignores all these other factors, and it pathologizes normal expressions. I'm someone who loves to move, as you can tell. I can't even stand still. I love to walk. I took a walk outside during the lunch break. Put me in a place with a locked door and find out how long it takes me to get restless. I don't have dementia. It's not about dementia. We use flawed systems categorization. Dan mentioned agitation. What is agitation? There could be a million different things that make a person distressed. And to say, we're going to try this intervention for agitation, it's ridiculous. It makes no scientific sense, and yet we're putting this into the realm of traditional science. And it doesn't explain how Cammie's group was able to reduce their antipsychotics from 30+% to 1.3%. If this is really a symptom of brain disease, they didn't all get cured, did they? And so on and on. I'm not going to go into all details about that. But I do want to say a couple other things about this. And when we at Schlegel Village, they talk about personal expressions. I agree with Dan. I use the word distress a lot. Sometimes that's obvious, but when the person is expressing themselves through words or actions, you might want to look and say, well, what could that be? And there are many things it could be. Some of it is distress, some of it isn't. It could be due to unmet needs, and I tend to look at it often as challenges to these domains of well-being. It could be sensory challenges, which we heard about from Agnes this morning. It could be just a new communication pathway. Sherry and I talked a lot about that in the past. The person doesn't use words anymore. This is how they express, as Dan's saying, someone pushes you away, they're giving you a choice. They're telling you something that we have to listen to. New methods of interpreting or problem solving. I remember a story from Cameron Camp where a woman would wake up in the nursing home, and every time she woke up, she'd yell her daughter's name, Linda, Linda, Linda. And every time a team member would come in and say, Linda's not here, what can I do for you? And the woman would ask her, and they would take care of it. And after days and days of this, finally a nurse went in the room when she yelled it out, and she said, you know Linda doesn't live here. And the woman nodded her head, and she said, why do you always call her name? And the woman said, when I wake up, I never know who's going to be here. But when I yell Linda, someone always comes. That was her process. It makes perfect sense when you think about it. And so once again, when you have, it's not, and a lot of these things aren't delusions. When you have holes in your memory, you come up with a way of filling in the gaps that works for you. That's not something that requires dopamine blockade through an antipsychotic. It's just getting around the blockages in your brain. It can be responses to different aspects of the environment. It could be normal reactions, as I said, and it might not even represent the stress, as Daniela mentioned this morning. So I have 7 things here. I put asterisks next to them because this, to my mind, is 95+% of the expressions you see, and none of them will ever respond to any pill you can invent. And this is why you can get down to 1%. Because when you find these things, you realize that the dementia is an enabler. Sure, it affects your communication pathways, your memory, your ability to cope with stressors, but it's not the root cause. You have to get to the root cause. So if you see somebody who seems distressed, and you're trying to figure out what are my choices for how to respond to this person, how would you respond if you're told what all of our articles tell us? 90% of people living with dementia will experience a BPSD during the course of their illness. Versus, how about if I told you 90% of people living with dementia will find themselves in a situation in which their well-being is not adequately supported? It gives you a whole different list of ideas, doesn't it, about how you might help this person. And pills end up not on there at all. Segregation can erode autonomy too. Locked doors, once again, prevent freedom of movement. Lack of choice in determining where to live. You know, the first barrier to autonomy is being moved to a segregated area. I'm sure it's occurred somewhere in the world, but in all my travels, I've never met a person living in memory care who toured various places and said, I want to live in that place with people with dementia with the door locked. I have yet to meet them. Maybe you know somebody. So on day one, your autonomy has been compromised by being moved to a place that you didn't choose. And so once again, I'm not saying that the people that work in various areas of memory care are incredibly talented people, but I just want to show how the model actually can make your job harder because it actually causes some organic infringement on rights. Often we have lack of individualization. If there's 130 different causes of dementia, individual personalities, individual levels of ability, why is there one place and one type of care? Does that make any sense? It's like saying everybody with brown eyes lives in the brown eye unit. That sounds silly. It's not that different. It's really not that different. Because we always say, the tired expression, if you've seen one person with dementia, you've seen one person with dementia. So let's have them all live in the dementia unit, right? It never really made sense. Stephen Sabat talks about the lack of contact with other people who are more cognitively able. You can pattern after, they can become caregivers, you can create really restorative relationships. And once again, if you have low expectations, that leads to self-fulfilling prophecies. And I've heard many stories of people who moved out of segregated living areas and began to blossom with abilities that people didn't think they had. And it wasn't that they weren't caring for them well, but somehow the environment was not enabling their greatest potential. So let's go to security. This is the big one. I'm throwing some challenges out there, but believe me, I value everything everybody does. I'm just trying to talk about systems because it's so much about systems that don't help us do what we need to do. Security and autonomy are on that kind of a seesaw here because a good sense of security can enable safe decision making, but too much focus on safety can disable it. And so how do we balance those two? This is really key. And I've discovered 2 things that erode autonomy in most living environments. And we're not just talking about long-term care here. This could be in your own house. This could be anywhere, any of these principles. And they're what I call all or none thinking and surplus safety. So all or none thinking is black and white. It's either this or it's that, and there's nothing in between. No shades of gray. And it stems from many things. First of all, the stigmas of dementia. That if you have dementia, you're no longer able to do this. As Dan was saying, the whole thing, you have a POA, you change address, and all of a sudden your POA starts speaking for you about everything, even though you're perfectly capable of doing that. The inability to see that people do have different levels of ability. It's never all or none. You may be able to do some things, but need help with others, or not be able to do other things at all. It's a misunderstanding of our role as carers, whether we are professionals or family members, and how much we step in. It's already been said so beautifully. I don't need to spend a lot of time on these. Misunderstanding of what empowerment is, and inflexible care systems also. Because one of the biggest barriers to autonomy is an inflexible care system that says, I would love to give you the time and assistance you need to do this independently, but sorry, I got to go to the next room. And time is the biggest barrier, I think, to autonomy, because it takes time to work with people, right? Surplus safety. This is something that my friends Judah Ronch and Bill Thomas talk about a lot. And it's getting to risk. And risk is, it's one of those things that's not good or bad. Risk is the chance that something will happen that's not what you expected. And we know what downside risk is. What are the chances that something worse will happen? So if Carrie gets up and walks by herself, what are the chances that she might fall and break her hip? Or if Dan goes outside, what are the chances she might get lost or walk into the street? Or if Josie goes to a social event, what are the chances she might be overwhelmed by the activity? And those are real, and we have to talk about those, but it's only half. There's also upside risk. What is the chance that something better will happen? So if Carrie gets up and walks, what are the chances her balance will improve, her independence, her strength? She'll be less restless, less sore, sitting in a chair all day. If Dan goes outside, what are the chances she'll sleep better at night? She'll have that fresh air and that daylight, and she'll feel much more invigorated as a result of that. If Josie goes to the event, what are the chances she'll blossom and become engaged and rediscover some of the abilities that she hasn't been able to express? So once again, you have to balance. But with long-term care in particular, and really with dementia in all living environments, we put almost all our focus on the downside, don't we? It's always physical safety over everything else. Here's my third remarkable quote from my friend Bill: the only risk-free human environment is a coffin. And that's the truth. I mean, if you do not eliminate risk. So how can we negotiate risk? How can we try to enable choice in the safest and healthiest way possible? Well, one thing is this idea of relational autonomy. This is not just I decide what to do or I can't decide what to do. It's how do we work through those strong, meaningful connections and relationships to help enable choice as much as possible. It means, first and foremost, we have got to optimize our communication and facilitation skills. We not only have to understand how to communicate to people living with dementia, but how to understand what they are communicating to us. And that gets into things, well, I'll get to that in a moment. But think about this. The most basic level of empowerment is good communication. If a person has trouble remembering, trouble expressing themselves, and you use poor communication skills, you have disempowered them to be understood. And this is the reason why I keep BPSD in here too, because when you, just to jump back a bit, when you write things off to brain disease, you are depriving people of one of the most basic human rights, and that is the right to be heard and understood. You're just writing it off and saying, oh, it's a brain disease. I don't have to understand what she's trying to do. And it's the same thing here. Good communication is our effort to understand that person and to have her direct her life to the maximum ability. Consider that ability is a spectrum. Look at upside risk, not just downside risk. And so instead of eliminating, we negotiate risk. You all negotiated risk by coming here today. You know, you may have come out on the 401. There was a horrible accident the other night. Maybe we should not drive on the 401 anymore. But you know that you have to balance risk with reward. Deep knowing and trust are key for relational autonomy. It means partnership approach. It means supported decision making. So the person does the most that they can, and you help them where you can, but in a very supportive way, not in a directive way. It's not easy. There's no simple recipe for it. But once again, it comes from the relationship, comes from knowing the person, and that means, of course, implications for dedicated assignments, because you are not going to be willing to take a chance on someone's decision if you don't know them very well. And once again, rotating staff is a big barrier to autonomy for people, because if we don't know people, we don't trust, we don't take a chance. Here's an example in the community. This woman, Brenda Roberts, does a regular blog about living with her husband, Mark. And Mark is no longer mowing the lawn, but they have quite a large lawn, and their lawnmower died. And he decided that they needed a really nice zero-turn lawnmower that would really do an efficient job of cutting the grass. And he found one and announced to Brenda they need to buy this, and it cost about $1,000. And they didn't have the money for that. And her response was, well, he doesn't know what he's doing anymore. We can't spend this for a lawnmower. He's not even cutting the grass. So we're just going to buy something else, and we'll make up a reason why we couldn't buy it. And they went to a family education seminar, which also talked about that phrase, nothing about us without us. And they had the insight that, you know, we're not including Mark. We seem to be afraid to talk to him about this. We can't be afraid to talk to him. So they sat down with Mark and they explained their concerns about his choice and that they wanted to include him. And Mark began to talk about how he realized he was having trouble making decisions, and he wanted to be involved, but he needed their help. And so they worked out a plan where they kind of showed him the mowers that they felt were in the budget, and they worked with him, and they found a very good mower for a fraction of the price, but he was in that decision. It wasn't just, you can do it, you can't do it, you're capable, you're not. So it's supported decision making, giving parameters and guidelines to help that person who really knew about the idea of lawn mowing, you know, really give an informed opinion about that. So how do we optimize relational skills? Well, once again, the basic levels of empowerment is learning communication. Can't emphasize that enough. Matter of fact, I've said many times that I believe if we had dedicated staff and we had optimal communication skills at all times, that 2/3 of all distress would disappear without doing anything else in the environment. I think they're that important, and I think we miss a lot when we don't do it. I can't prove that, but I think that it's that important. Understanding barriers to communication, understanding how people communicate differently, shifts to emotional or symbolic-based expression. Maybe it's not the words they're saying, maybe it's the feeling behind them, or the symbolism of what they're saying that you have to understand. Understanding embodiment, that people who lose words or don't use words may actually use gestures or actions to communicate, and learning what that person does. Working together through tasks, and once again using, this is a Daniela term, continual consent. Always checking in, not saying what you're going to do, but asking and making sure the person understands and is accepting before proceeding. When you're discussing with people a decision that you may have some concerns about, I put in my second book, Dementia Beyond Disease, a 7-step pathway for negotiating risk. And this is one thing that you might follow for a number of people where you're trying to arrive at a decision that everybody's comfortable with. The first thing is to discuss with the person what they want to do, what that person wants to do, what it means to that person to do it, what their feeling is about it, and just try to get the best understanding you can of what a person wants, so you really understand how important it is to them. The second thing is, and this is part of it, is really understanding the values behind that, tying it into the person's well-being needs. What will this feed? Will this help feed their meaning, help feed their growth, help feed their connectedness? And then look at the conditions of empowerment. Empowerment's not just go do it. When your child comes of age, you don't hand them the car keys and say, okay, you're empowered, right? No, you take your life in your hands, you get in the passenger seat, and you teach them, because empowerment is very much a hands-on process. People get that backwards all the time. And people need constant encouragement, they need resources, they need practice. So these things may come into play as well. But there's also a continuum. Maybe you can drive. Maybe you can only drive during the daytime. Maybe you can only drive to places in your neighborhood. Maybe you can drive when there's someone with you. Maybe you can drive in certain circumstances, good weather. So there's always different degrees and ways that you can collaborate, and try to come to as collaborative a process as possible. And then the next thing, of course, is to watch what happens, because you may not get it right. And if it doesn't work out well, it doesn't mean you quit. It means you go back and say, okay, which of these things did we not really get quite right? How can we go back and tweak this process so we can make it better? The other reason you monitor results is that people's abilities, needs change over time. And what works today may not work 9 months from now. So you always have to look in. And the last part, keeping other stakeholders abreast. Once again, I will take to heart Daniela's concern to make sure that the person wants the people involved who are being involved. And you never inform, whether it be a family member or another team member or a regulator, you never inform them, giving them permission to veto. It's just so, sometimes one of the biggest problems is you surprise people. They walk in and something's happening that they didn't expect. And you don't need to surprise people. If the person's okay with explaining the process, that's great. And always document. I've had many, many surveyors say to me, we don't expect that nothing bad will ever happen in a care home. But if something happens and we come in, we want to see that there was a process, a thought process behind this that balanced the risks and talked about possibilities. If we see that a well-intentioned effort was made, you know, these things happen. Here's an example of values. This is from Danielle as well. Joan and Harry. She gave me this for my book. I was talking about, I showed her the 7-step process. She goes, I got the perfect example of individual values. So I don't think this is the same Joan that wore the plunging necklines. No, this is not Joan. I just got pictures off of Dr. Google. But Joan was a woman who worked as a milliner in the same factory for her entire career. She grew up in the house, or she lived in the house she grew up in, cared for her aging parents till they died. She attended the same church her entire life, and rarely ventured outside her usual neighborhood. And she was very distressed when her favorite shop changed hands about 30 years ago. So you got a picture of Joan, right? Harry was a construction engineer who actually scaled some of the tallest buildings in Melbourne. That's why I put that picture there. That actually makes me weak in the knees, so I'm not going to look at it. He likes to drink lots of red wine. I don't know if you ever had any red wine parties together. And he used to tromp around the outback, you know, looking for new adventures, going walkabout maybe. And that was, freedom was very important to Harry. Now, do you think that you could write a policy for your home that would satisfy both Joan and Harry? There's no way. You know, you go to a financial advisor and they're going to take your money and invest it. The first thing they ask you is, what's your tolerance for risk? Because some of you want to buy bonds and some of you want to buy junk bonds. And so we need to know, where are your values? I've heard people say, don't tie me down. This is back in the restraint days. I don't care if I fall and die. I would rather do that tomorrow than live here with this thing on my chair. That's an important thing to hear from people. Other people might say, you know, I'm worried about this. I have concerns. I don't want to do that because I might get hurt. So you need to know those things. So let me tell you a story about Wentworth Heights. Where's Heather? Heather's here, right? Heather gave me this. Heather's given me so many great things since she became the coordinator for the Dementia Program Committee. And I love this story about, I'm going to call him Fred. And when I went to first tour Wentworth Heights about a year ago, Fred actually let us in because there was a door code. And I tried to look for the sign, and Heather said, nope, Fred's here, he'll let you in. So he did, and he greeted us and said hello. But he had actually moved in at age 90 back in 2012. He is of Polish descent. He was a World War II vet, was actually a prisoner of war after being caught by the Germans during the war. And he didn't have a lot of family support, and not very close to his son, and lived in the community, had an active social life, but because of his dementia was having more and more trouble managing alone. And so he moved into Wentworth and moved into an area where there was a lot of freedom to move around, but the door to the outside had a keypad. And he didn't have the code to the keypad. And he became on a daily basis distressed. This is not, you don't have to guess, is he distressed? This is the kind of person where you go right to a care conference because every day he's having problems. And so Heather had a talk with him. And Fred told his story and talked about his being captured by the Germans. And he said, you know, I've fought, I've done all these things. He said, and now here I am, and I'm a prisoner again. And this is a really powerful thing. And so Heather said to him, what would you do if you could go outside? And he said, I would like to sit out there in the sunshine and feed the birds and watch the people go by. So Heather went back to the team and said, can we teach Fred the code? There was some discussion about that. Not everybody was comfortable. But they decided ultimately to do it. Now, I just want to see where I'm at. Okay. It took about 2 weeks to teach him the code. It took a lot of repetition, but he learned it. And he maintained it, you know, retained it for years afterward. And he would go outside and he would feed the birds and he would greet people and enjoy the sunshine. After a while, he started talking about wanting to go back to his old neighborhood, check on his house. And he used to go down to the local cafe or pub and hang out with his friends. And he talked about wanting to do that. And the staff kept putting him off. You know, wait till your son comes in. He didn't come in very often. Maybe we'll get somebody to take you there, maybe next week, you know. Well, one day, Fred was sitting outside and the bus pulled up. What do you think Fred did? Took the bus, disappeared, and, you know, kudos to you. Older people in the neighborhood can take the bus for free. He didn't have to worry about that, but he took the bus, apparently checked on his house, and ended up at the cafe. And they knew what he had said, so one of the team members drove out to the cafe, and there he was with his buds. He greeted them, and he very gladly came back. So here's the poll question. 2 poll questions. And we have people online who are going to vote, and we're going to give you about 30 seconds. And these are 4 choices. I'd like you to choose your best choice, and each of you think of your choice. This is you now. You're the boss. You're the one who's going to make the decision. You come back to the CARE conference. What would you do next? And here's 4 possible choices I'm giving you. Change the door code, revoke his privileges outdoors. Change the code. He can go outside, but only when accompanied by a family, staff, or volunteer. Continue the present plan with or without maybe some minor adjustments, or maybe something else I haven't mentioned or you don't know. So I'm going to give people outside a chance to plug it in. We'll see how it comes up. And you think about what you would choose. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So far for the people online, 100% are saying continue present plan plus or minus minor modification.
100%.
Everybody's voting for number 3.
Do they all work at Wentworth Heights?
Maybe that's the next poll question.
Let me say this first. There is not a right answer here, okay? Once again, I'm not telling you the right answer. I'm telling you these are the things you have to go through to find the best solution. So I'm not going to tell you number 3 is right, 1, 2, and 4 are wrong. But number 3 is basically what Wentworth did. They decide, because think about this. Think about what Fred exhibited. He planned this. He had excellent executive function in this respect. He took the bus. He knew where to take it. He went to his house. He walked to the cafe. He met up with his friends. He willingly came back. There was nothing there that indicated a really high risk of something really terrible going on. So yeah, there's risk, but they decided, let's keep going. Now fast forward to when I met Fred last year, and it was four years in, and in the course of 4 years, Fred had actually taken the bus 3 times. Now, once again, in a very high, liability conscious environment, regulatory environment, we might say that was 3 opportunities for something disastrous to happen. But 3 times in 4 years. We're talking about, I think I calculated something like 1,461 days. Think about the way he was every day, pounding on the door, distressed. Think about if he got Risperdal twice a day, how many doses of Risperdal he would have gotten over 4 years, 1,400 days, versus 3 chances to take the bus. So I'm not telling you right or wrong, but you have to balance the good with the bad. You can't just look at those 3 times and say, oh, if we drugged him for 1,400 days or locked the door, things would have been better, because they wouldn't necessarily have been better. He might not be alive today if he'd been put on an antipsychotic 4 years ago. Now, Fred has changed in the last year. He has had a little more trouble. And what they have managed to do is to continue to help him. He's still getting outside, I believe. But they have found a volunteer who actually speaks Polish, too, because his son doesn't come in very often. So the volunteer actually takes him on scheduled visits. And it goes on the calendar. And this way, he doesn't feel the need to create his own opportunity, because they have some regular. So they've modified the plan because his needs and desires have also modified. Oh, I forgot to ask poll question number 2. Okay, we'll see if you're all at Wentworth or not. I asked you what you would do. Vote on this one. What do you think your organization would have done? I want to see how much a lineup there is. Let me ask people here. Are you willing to show your hands? How many people think that there's a match between what you would have done and what your organization would have done? Raise your hand. How many people can say fairly certainly that what you would have done is not what your bosses would have told you to do, or your organization? We're not getting a lot of hands. Okay. Okay, let me know, Chelsea and Kate, when you get the answers.
Yeah, so far it looks like so more people now are saying number 1, change the door code, revoke privileges. That's number 1. Number 3 is second place, so continue present plan with a little bit of modification,
yeah.
And as well change the code outside only when accompanied. And it seems like number 1, change the door code, revoke privileges,
Yeah.
is what people are thinking.
And I think that there are probably a lot of inspectors that would say that too. But I can tell you that that would cause real harm. knowing what I know about Fred, that would cause real harm. And we can't ignore the harm that would cause. So I'll just touch quickly on meaning and growth. I love the talk that Amy gave about the academy. That's growth. That's growth, and the idea that people were selecting those topics, astronomy and ethics, and really cool. But I want to talk to something that you said there about those subjects. This is a quick story from Tennessee. I love this. My friend Court Nygaard, who's a consulting psychologist, went to see a gentleman, and this gentleman didn't have dementia, but this is really telling, I think. He used to lay floors for a living, got rheumatoid arthritis, couldn't work, became disabled, couldn't live at home alone anymore, needed assistance, moved into an assistive living retirement community, was depressed, felt worthless. Court went to see him for his depression, and the man just said, I just feel useless. And Court, trying to be helpful, said, well, what can we do? They probably need some help folding laundry. Would you like to do that? And he said, no, that's busy work. I don't want to do that. So Court, being wise, stopped suggesting and said, what would be meaningful to you? And the man thought about it for a second. He said, I want you to give me a job to do where if I screw it up, something bad happens. Now, if you're a general manager or perhaps an inspector, that might strike fear in your heart. But what he was saying is what Amy and her colleagues discovered, and that is that failure-free activities have no meaning. You do not gain meaning or purpose in your life, and you do not grow. So if you say everybody graduates, no matter how many courses you come to, and the elders rejected that, and they said, no, we want a standard. We want a goal, and we can pass or fail. So what I learned from that is that the question is not how do you provide activities that are failure-free, it's how do you provide engagement where people can safely fail from time to time. If you don't graduate, it's not physically damaging. You might feel a little let down, but it's something to aim for. And that way, when you make it, when you get that cap and gown, it means something. And if you don't do that, if you offer failure-free activities, people don't come away with any sense of meaning. A small child will stop racing if you let him win every single time, because he realizes very quickly that this is not a game anymore because there's no competition. So once again, it's really important to understand that you need to enable choice in order to have meaning, and you need to have the opportunity of good or bad outcomes if you want things to happen. What about downside risk? Yeah, it's real. So we always start with relationships because that's how we minimize the downside. And here's what you can do. If you're talking about maybe Carrie walking and you're worried about her falling and you want to get rid of that horrible alarm that's making her fall probably, start, and you have a lot of people with alarms and you want to stop them. Start first of all with incremental steps. Find the person whose needs are easiest to understand and meet and work with that person first. Give yourself an easy win. And two things happen. Number one, you minimize the downside risk by taking the person that has the least risk, not the person who's in the greatest risk of danger. And also, in order to make her successful, you have to have a slight shift in the way your team does things. Little incremental shifts. And then you pick somebody else. And as you go along, there's a learning curve and a slight shifting of operations. And by the time you get to Daniela going outside, which you thought would never be safe to do, you have made so many learnings and you've made so many shifts in the way you do things that all of a sudden you have answers. And all of a sudden what looked like an insurmountable downside risk is not there anymore because you have found ways to negotiate that. Does that make sense? So I always recommend people, if I'm teaching the high jump, put the bar here first. Don't start with the bar there. You'll fail and you'll say it doesn't work. You've got to give yourself the ability to succeed and to learn as you go. And I put this, I would, the locked doors is another whole talk, but I did a 4-part blog I'm part of the blog roll on changingaging.org. And I did a 4-part blog last year called The Hidden Restraint, about locked doors and about unlocking doors. And this is just a quote I want to kind of finish things up with. An injury or death after leaving a building is a serious event and would likely be reported all over the news. The gravity of such outcomes is not to be minimized. But for every person who actually suffers such a fate, how many people on a daily basis are forced to live with anxiety, fear, and life-giving needs that remain unmet, or withdraw and give up on life as prisoners of war have done, or become over-medicated with dangerous and sedating drugs? Hundreds or thousands? These are also very newsworthy negative outcomes that will start to be more widely publicized as consumer awareness grows. We must always negotiate risk, balancing it against the ability to live life to the fullest extent possible. And I'm going to leave you with one more quote. I won't claim this is remarkable because it's one of mine, but I think what I'd like to leave you with is that maybe the most dangerous situation for people living with dementia is self-fulfilling prophecies. And if we enable those, we may be causing more harm than good. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I've left a little bit of time for some discussion. Thanks very much, everybody.
And I think one of the biggest barriers that I've seen in the work that I've done is families and their perception of risk. Yeah. And how can we use relational autonomy, which I love, because it's not just about the resident and the staff, it's also about family, and how do we engage in that negotiation process with family. So could you speak a little bit about your insights on that?
It's kind of where I put step 7 there about keeping other people apprised of things. I do agree with Dan that we really need to start with the person, and we need to put that person in charge. And we need to make sure that bringing in the family, is something that is permissible to that person. But if there is obviously a conflict, I don't think there's any harm in kind of sharing in a round table what everybody's concerns are. Just like when you have teams solving conflict instead of the boss, you all sit around and you have a huddle or a learning circle and you talk about what you're all concerned about and balance that. And that's kind of what Brenda and Mark did with the lawnmower. They got back together and they said, listen, we're concerned about this. And he said, well, this is what I want and I'm concerned too. So I think that the more we can facilitate dialogue, the better. But I think it's really important, to go back to the opening talk, to really make sure that we do make it clear, though, that this person is a citizen. My friend Carmen Bowman, who's a former surveyor, now a culture change specialist, she, our basic F-tag, 151, resident rights F-tag, I don't know the language, but the way she interprets this is people living in nursing homes have the same rights as every other citizen of the country. And so we need to keep that citizenship first and foremost. And the other thing I love that Daniela says is the duty of care is not to the ministry, it's not to the family. The primary duty of care is to create well-being for that person. And we have to be willing to draw that line as long as we're not being irresponsible about what we're doing. And I think we have to educate, just like I'm talking about this with a group of professionals. Anything that I talk about is fair game to talk to other residents and family members about. There's no reason why every group shouldn't be part of it. And the last thing I'll mention, because Candace Manwaring asked the question of Daniela earlier, and you didn't go there, so I'll just add it on. Another thing that Daniela noticed when they went to dedicated assignments is that some of those unrealistic family expectations melted away because the families developed a relationship with the dedicated team member who was then able to convince them that their mom didn't want to do that, when as a rotating team member they could never get that trust. So the relationships really drive everything, I think.
That is a real relational autonomy there. So you're looking at potentially autonomy depleting relationships, kind of brought into line with these more protective relationships, and that definitely happened. Exact story about someone waking up, and then that's because the family's had a pretty low bar. If mum's not up, we've forgotten her, and she didn't trust it because she was seeing different care staff. But that care staff, there was. The trust between that carer and that family is what led to that resident, without any hassles or more complaints, sleeping in as late as she blink and well wanted, which was really where that came into action. So that trust between the family and the staff does tend to override that. But we all of us have autonomy, but it's all about always our relationships that mediate it. I mean, I could do what I want, but there's times I won't leave home because people really want to spend time with me, or my mother really wants me to be with her. So is that my autonomy being infringed on? No, I'm doing that because of my relationships. And relationships are where we express autonomy and we practice our skills of autonomy. And I think the carer was doing that in solidarity with Susan, who could now sleep in.
Yeah, and I like using, that's great. I appreciate your expanding on that. And I always use the example of going to a doctor who diagnoses some sort of a medical problem. And I fortunate to go to a medical school and work with a physician in my outpatient work who really taught a partnership and relational approach. But even so, I can lay out what the person is diagnosed with and what all their treatment options are, but I have a background of knowledge. And so that person may say to me, well, what would you do in my situation? They want to know my opinion. So it's not just, I'm the doctor, but it's your choice. So you decide what to do. So we are working together as a team to help understand what's the right thing for that person. And like I said, it's not a right or wrong. You're going to have these conflicts. Conflicts are part of human nature, And some people say, well, if we mix people with dementia and without, there's going to be some conflicts. And I say, hey, what's your neighborhood like? Don't your neighbors park their car in the grass or play their stereo too loud at night? I mean, this is, when you're in a human community, there's always going to be conflict. So don't set it up because of diagnosis, but we always negotiate this. And culture change, nothing I've said is easy, first of all. If you thought I said it was, I apologize. But culture change doesn't eliminate your debates and your discussions and your disagreements. It just raises the level of them. And it's always, and the key, as I've said to a couple people in discussions today, is it's not about rules or policies. It's about letting your core values drive everything. And when you speak to values instead of rules, then you can see the nuances, and then you can be not equal, but fair. And that's what's more important, is to not be equal, but to be fair.
Going back to the quote that you had on your blog, and the idea that if something tragic happens, it is a devastating thing, and you can have people who will make many steps forward, great progress, and then all of a sudden the media does latch on to some terrible incident. What do you do to navigate that when you've done all this work and now everybody is so scared about what might possibly happen, and you've lost all that effort?
You have to find a non-blaming forum for talking about what happened, for going through it, seeing what the steps were, examining what went wrong, and looking at the system, looking at the choices that were made and the steps you took to negotiate risk, and saying, okay, where did we, not where did you, or it's the night shift, the day shift, where did we fall short? How did we not quite give this person what they needed? And but you need to understand that that's part of the journey. If you never fail, you never grow. And I'm not saying we should be irresponsible or not be sensitive to that, but everything that happens, whether it's small or whether it's large, it has to be a teaching. As DeWitt Jones, the photographer, says, you move from a win-lose culture to a win-learn culture. And you have to do that, and you have to move forward. And if you believe that what you did was based on the person's fundamental rights and was done with the right values, then you have to press on. You can't go back to anything that infringes on people because somebody ran into something bad. You think about, this guy's World War II, you think about people storming the beaches of Normandy, what that was like. Can you imagine telling one of those people, you can't go outside, it's not safe? I mean, think about that. Sure, his capabilities have changed, but do we have the right to tell any other human being that they can decide how they live and die? And I think often we're being told that we have to do that. I'm going to warn you of something. My generation, those nasty baby boomers, are coming of age. And I've often said that the baby boomers will change aging, but not until they actually admit that they're aging, because there's a lot of denial going on. Probably none bigger than in the AARP, who likes to publish their magazine showing you how young everybody over 50 looks, But anyway, but you mentioned the last quote, so I want to go there. When I started in long-term care and restraints were just starting to remove restraints, people, sometimes family members, would say, if my mother falls because you untied her, I'm going to sue you. And then after several years, they said, if you tie my mother, I'm going to sue you. Yeah. And people used to say, if you don't give her a drug to calm her down, I'm going to sue you. And I'll tell you, before my phone number became unpublished, I got cold calls several times a year from families or lawyers all over the country who want me to testify at the trial of somebody who had drugged their mother or father, who was prosecuting because they were given antipsychotics. So right now, if somebody gets outside because the door's not locked, you see the liability. But when people start campaigning for human rights, and it's coming, we've heard some talks about it. I'm co-writing a book with Dan and Mary Radnofsky, who lives with dementia in the US, looking at common choices among people living with dementia from that UN Human Rights Convention standpoint, and tying it into the rights that the United Nations says we have. Because we still talk about care, we talk about decisions, we talk about autonomy, but human rights, when I started this work, I thought it was about antipsychotics, and I realized it wasn't about antipsychotics. They were a symptom. It was about creating well-being. And now what's even deeper, what I'm realizing now, is it's about human rights. That's where it comes down to. And we have to always keep that in mind.
obviously residents' rights and each individual is entitled to that. But what happens when those rights conflict, and if you have any words of wisdom, because we have a really high population of dementia in our home, much, much higher than the provincial average. And so we do have a secured unit, which oddly enough isn't actually even legal under our legislation, but we still have them. And then we have other home areas that have a blend. So we have a gentleman who's wandering, and he's not really hurting anybody.
Yeah.
And then we have another resident who's like, the family is wild and he could do this and he might do that, and you need to get him out of here and that sort of thing. So any words of wisdom
It's
and
a
how to
thorny
balance
issue,
that?
and I'm going to make this sound overly simplistic because we're short on time, but it's a good question. It's a common one. And I'll go back, once again to what Dan said this morning. One thing about, distress can be I'm distressed, or something I'm doing is distressing other people. It's worth confronting that. I think that there are a lot of things going on that we don't realize are behind this. And my personal theory is that a lot of this is erosion of well-being. And I use this one model, but it could be the census framework. It could be a good model of well-being. And so I often find that these conflicts happen because both parties do not have well-being. So that person may be walking somewhere because they're looking for meaning or connectedness or autonomy, and they haven't got it in their environment. And the other person may feel threatened because there's no security. The team members are coming in, opening their drawers and touching their glasses and not asking for it. And so they're both in a place where their well-being is challenged. And being a tea drinker, I liken it to having a pot of water on the stove. You turn the water on, it takes a while for the water to come to a boil. And I think when these conflicts occur, often it's because we've never been taught how to proactively enhance well-being. We're taught how to change dressings and how to measure vitals and how to transfer somebody. But people are walking along with their kettle right just below 100 degrees all the time. And it can take the slightest thing, a bath, somebody coming in your room, to push people over the edge. So by proactively bringing these well-being domains into your life plan, you start to bring the heat down. And you start to create answers to the needs that lead both of them to have that kind of an issue. It sounds simple, but I can tell you in the greenhouse homes, the small house model I helped open at St. John's, we have 2 homes, the only ones in the country that are actually in a real residential community, not on the campus, and 10 people in each. And these homes have a beautiful footprint, a beautiful layout. Everybody's got a private room, and they have dedicated staff. And in 5 years, there was a DON that didn't work, and I think someone else retired. There's not been another turnover in 5 years in these 2 houses. And the people that live in these houses don't walk in each other's rooms. And they don't try to go out the front door. They have a door to the courtyard they can use because they are home. And it sounds simplistic, but we do so many physical cues that confuse people. The layouts of where people live do not look like where you would live. And so a lot of people with dementia are looking for the bedroom. They're looking for the kitchen. And we don't realize how much those cues lead people the wrong way. So once again, that's a big thing, rebuilding, redesigning. But when you can create an environment that physically and operationally creates home and well-being for people, those things that we blame on dementia, and one of them is so-called elopement, one of them is intrusive wandering, they are gone in our greenhouses. We do not see them. And it's been 5 years, and it's because you've gotten there. So can't get there tomorrow, but you have to start to look at that. And what I do is, it's in chapter 10 of my second book. I do a well-being plan where I just take each of those person's 7 domains of well-being and say which ones are most challenged. How can we proactively enhance each of those domains all day for those people? And you won't see a quick fix. It's not calm in a half hour like a pill, But over time, you will see the person who's looking for things being more satisfied, and the person who's more threatened understanding the person better. That's just kind of very simplistic, but it's a long process. But I've seen it happen again and again, and I found the application of this process to be very successful and to have the kind of successes that Cammie's had too, getting people really eliminating antipsychotics and eliminating a lot of these things that we're blaming as symptoms of dementia again, but really are much more relational environmental cues. Thanks for that.